She stepped off that stagecoach in the dead of winter, 1873. The town was Silver Peak, Montana, but it looked more like hell frozen over. A handful of wooden shacks clinging to a mountainside, spitting smoke into a gray, unforgiving sky. The wind cut through her thin cotton dress like a razor, and the one small bag she held contained every single thing she owned in this world. The locals, what few there were, stopped and stared. Miners mostly, with faces caked in dirt and eyes that hadn't seen a woman in months. They looked at her like a ghost, or a meal. This delicate little thing from back east, they must have thought. She won't last a week. They had no idea who they were looking at. 20 years from that moment, they would call her the Queen of the Frontier. They'd tell stories about how she faced down killers and corporations, how she saved this town from being wiped off the map during the Great Blizzard of '78, how she built an empire from nothing but sheer, unbreakable will. This is the story of Alara Parker, a desperate mail-order bride who arrived with empty pockets, but a spirit forged in fire. And trust me, you're going to want to hear how she did it. Back in Boston, Alara sat at a tiny desk, her hands shaking as she sealed the letter. This was it, the move that would either save her life or end it. She was 22, an orphan, with nothing to her name but the clothes on her back, and 2 weeks left to pay her rent at the boarding house. Mrs. Holloway, the landlady, had made that perfectly clear that morning. "I don't run a charity, Miss Parker." Alara knew the options for a woman like her in Boston. The factories were a slow death, the streets a fast one. So she'd found the advertisement, tucked away in the back of a newspaper like a dirty secret. Wives wanted. Strong, virtuous women sought by successful frontiersmen in Montana. Passage paid. It was a gamble with the highest stakes imaginable. She was betting her life on a man she'd never met, in a place she couldn't even find on a map. The letter she'd just sealed was her entire wager. A faded photograph, a promise to be a hard-working wife, and a plea for a new life sent to a Mr. Jackson Sullivan, Silver Peak, Montana. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived back. It was short, blunt. "Your character seems suitable. Passage enclosed. I require a woman to maintain my household." That was it. No romance, no kind words, just a train ticket and an address. The journey west was a nightmare. The train was a rolling cage of filth and sweat. Other passengers looked at her with a mix of pity and contempt when they learned her story. "Another one selling herself to some brute in the territories," a woman whispered, loud enough for her to hear. Alara almost turned back. But where would she go? Boston was a death sentence. Montana was just a question mark. She remembered her father's last words to her before the fever took him. "Courage isn't about being fearless, Ellie. It's about being terrified but moving forward anyway." So she moved forward. Day after day, the green fields of the east bled away, replaced by a brutal, beautiful landscape that seemed to stretch into forever. The girl she'd been in Boston was stripped away with every mile, replaced by someone harder, quieter. By the time she stepped onto that final stagecoach, the one that would take her to Silver Peak, she was a different person, a survivor. "Silver Peak, just over that ridge," the driver grunted, pointing his whip at a jagged mountain. "Not much to look at, but the silver's been good to the men who survived to work it." Survived. The word hung in the cold air. The coach crested the hill, and there it was, her new home. The driver pulled the horses to a stop. "Last stop." He said it like a final judgment. Alara stepped down onto trembling legs. The cold was a physical blow. She'd sold her coat for food 3 days earlier, a decision she was regretting with every shiver. Snowflakes began to fall, melting on her face like icy tears. The coach pulled away, leaving her utterly alone in the middle of a muddy street, clutching her bag to her chest as the miners stared. Then a figure emerged from the largest building, the saloon. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and he moved like he owned the ground he walked on. As he got closer, Alara's heart stopped. This had to be him, Jackson Sullivan. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 40, with a face that looked like it had been carved from rock and left out in the sun and wind for too long. His beard was streaked with gray, but it was the scar that made her breath catch. a long, jagged line that ran from his left temple all the way down to his chin, pulling one side of his mouth into a permanent, cruel-looking sneer. "Miss Parker," he said. His voice was like gravel. She could only nod, forcing herself to meet his eyes. They were the palest blue she'd ever seen, and they were looking at her like she was a piece of livestock he was considering buying. "You're smaller than I expected," he said, his gaze sweeping over her thin frame. "Not much use for hauling water or tending a garden." Something inside Alara snapped. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but something else rose up to meet it. Defiance. She straightened her back, lifting her chin. "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Sullivan, and I'm a fast learner." For just a second, a flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed his face. Then it was gone. "We'll see," he grunted. "Come on, storm's coming in." He turned and walked away, not even offering to take her bag. He just expected her to follow. And with every eye in Silver Peak watching her, Alara Parker took a deep breath and followed the scarred man into her new life. She had no way of knowing she was walking straight into the heart of a mystery, a town full of secrets, and that the monster she thought she was following was something else entirely. His house was at the edge of town, bigger than the others, made of solid, rough-hewn logs. It looked like a fortress. He was a careful man, she noted. The firewood was stacked perfectly, the foundation solid. Whatever else he wasn't careless. "This will be your home now," he said, pushing the door open. He added a chilling condition. "If you prove satisfactory." The inside was surprisingly warm, a huge stone fireplace dominating the main room. It was sparsely furnished but clean. A table, some chairs, a couple of bookshelves. But there was a layer of dust on everything. A man's house lived in, but not cared for. "Your room is upstairs," he said, pointing. "Mine is down here." He gestured to a closed door off the main room. A wave of relief washed over Alara. At least she wouldn't have to share a bed with him. Not yet, anyway. He laid out the terms of their arrangement like a business contract. "I run the assay office and own part of the Silver Queen mine. I'm gone from sunup to sundown. You'll be responsible for the house, the meals, the mending." "Can you cook?" "Yes," she lied. She'd helped in the boarding house kitchen, but that was it. "Good. Kitchen's out back. Pumps in the yard. Outhouse is 50 paces behind the house. I've strung a rope to follow in a blizzard." He delivered these facts without a hint of warmth. Then he noticed her shivering. His eyes narrowed. "Where's your coat?" I had to sell it," she admitted, her voice small. "For food." His face hardened into a scowl. "Foolish. You'll freeze to death here without proper gear." He crossed to a heavy trunk in the corner and pulled out a thick wool blanket. "Wrap this around you." And he didn't hand it to her. He tossed it. She caught it, wrapping it gratefully around her shoulders. It smelled of cedar and him. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She nodded, ashamed of the desperate hunger she felt. He moved to the lean-to kitchen, and she watched as he expertly stoked a cast-iron stove and put a pot of stew on to heat. "I usually have this ready when I get home," he said. It wasn't a comment. It was an order for the future. They ate in a thick, uncomfortable silence. The stew was venison and vegetables, and it was the best thing Alara had ever tasted. She cleaned her bowl, then a second. Sullivan just watched her, his expression unreadable. When they were done, he showed her to the small bedroom upstairs. A narrow bed, a washstand, a small window looking out at the endless, falling snow. "Extra blankets in the chest," he said from the doorway. "Winter nights here can freeze the blood in your veins." With that charming thought, he turned and left, his heavy boots thudding down the stairs. The sound of a lock clicking into place downstairs sent a fresh wave of terror through her. He had locked her in. Alara sat on the edge of the bed, the wool blanket still clutched around her. What had she done? She was trapped, a prisoner in the house of a scarred, cold man in a town that felt like the end of the world. She unpacked her few belongings, a spare dress, her mother's Bible, a small silver hairbrush. She placed the Bible on the bedside table, a useless talisman against the fear that was closing in. Exhausted, too terrified to even cry, she crawled under the covers fully dressed and fell into a sleep haunted by pale blue eyes and the sound of a key turning in a lock. Morning came, with a blinding light reflecting off the fresh snow. Elara woke with a start, her heart pounding. The house was silent. The lock. She crept to her door and twisted the knob. It opened. He hadn't locked her in. The sound she'd heard must have been the front door. Relief made her dizzy. Downstairs, the main room was empty. A fire was already going, and on the table was a note held down by a heavy silver coin. Gone to work. Return at midday. Use coin for necessities at Mason's general store. She clutched the coin. A test? A trick? Or a simple instruction? For now, she had a reprieve. She set to work exploring her new domain. The kitchen was basic but well-stocked. The water pump was frozen solid, and it took her 20 minutes of frantic work with a heavy iron poker to break the ice and get a trickle of water. The 50 paces to the outhouse felt like a mile through the deep snow. The guide rope a lifeline in the white wilderness. By the time Sullivan returned, she had swept the floors, dusted every surface, and had a pot of coffee brewing. The house already felt different, a woman's touch beginning to erase the harsh edges of his bachelor life. He stamped the snow off his boots, his eyes scanning the room. If he noticed the changes, he didn't say a word. "Come," he said. "Time you met the town." He handed her a coat. It was heavy wool, worn but incredibly warm, and far too big. "It was Mrs. Whitaker's," he explained, his voice flat. "She passed last month. Her husband said you might as well have it." Elara swallowed hard, pulling on the dead woman's coat. It felt like a terrible omen. Silver Peak by daylight was just as grim, but now she could see the details. The Silver Nugget Saloon, Mason's general store, a barber shop, the assay office where Sullivan worked, and a small, lonely-looking church. There were hardly any women. She counted 3 the entire time they walked. She felt their eyes on her, a mix of curiosity and pity. Their first stop was the general store. The owner, Mr. Mason, was a round man who looked out of place on the frontier. "Ah, Mr. Sullivan," he said, peering over his spectacles, "and this must be your correspondent bride." "This is Miss Parker," Sullivan corrected him. "She needs proper winter clothing." He then stepped back, leaving Elara to make her selections. It was another test. With the silver coin and Sullivan's silent credit, she carefully chose what was absolutely necessary. Warm stockings, sturdy boots, a practical woolen dress. The prices were outrageous, but she knew better than to complain. Their tour continued. The assay office, where his young assistant, Thomas, looked at Sullivan with a kind of terrified awe. The doctor's office, where the grizzled man who pulled teeth and set bones gave her a grim once-over. Then they stopped at the schoolhouse, a one-room log cabin at the edge of town. The teacher, Miss Sarah Jenkins, was a woman of about 30, with a stern face but intelligent eyes. "We have 18 children," she told Elara, when they bothered to show up. "Miss Parker was educated in Boston," Sullivan said, the word startling Elara. It was the first time he'd acknowledged anything about her past. "Perhaps she could assist you." Miss Jenkins' face lit up. "That would be most welcome. It is a lonely endeavor." Their final stop was the home of Margaret Wilson, the wife of the general store owner. She was a warm, talkative woman who seemed starved for female company. "Another woman! Praise the Lord!" she exclaimed, pulling Elara inside for tea. While Sullivan spoke with her husband, Mrs. Wilson gave Elara a rapid-fire education in survival. She talked about the long winters, which men to avoid at the saloon, and the best way to store vegetables. Then she lowered her voice. "You've chosen a good man, dear," she whispered, glancing toward the other room. "He's complicated. What happened to his first wife, Rebecca? It marked him." Before Elara could ask, Sullivan was ready to leave. Walking back to the house, Elara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. What happened to his first wife? The question burned in her mind. She gathered her courage. "Mr. Sullivan, Mrs. Wilson mentioned your first wife." His whole body went rigid. The pleasantries of the day vanished. "My past is my own," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You would do well to remember that." The wall between them was back, higher and colder than before. That night, after another silent dinner, he didn't ask her to read from the books on his shelf, as she had half expected. Instead, he took a bottle of whiskey and a single glass and sat by the fire, his back to her. Ilara retreated to her room, her mind racing. The townspeople were afraid of him. Mrs. Wilson spoke of his first wife in hushed tones, and he refused to speak of it at all. She lay in her bed, listening to the wind howl outside, and a terrifying thought took root in her mind. People died in this harsh place all the time. Accidents happened. But what if Rebecca's death wasn't an accident? What if the scar on Jackson Sullivan's face wasn't from some random misfortune, but from the same night his wife died? What if the man she had agreed to marry was a killer? The days that followed were a tightrope walk of tension. Ilara learned the rhythm of the house, the rhythm of him. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended. She learned to bake bread in the temperamental stove, to keep the fire banked just right so it wouldn't go out during the night. She created a fragile order in the silent house, a defense against the chaos of her thoughts. She also started assisting Miss Jenkins at the schoolhouse twice a week. The children, rough and wild as they were a comfort. They didn't have the guarded eyes of the adults. And through them, she started to learn more about the town. Little things, scraps of overheard conversations. The children whispered stories about Old Man Sullivan. They said he had the devil's own luck. They said he'd found the Silver Queen mine on a night so stormy it should have killed him. They said he'd come down from the mountain the next morning with a bag full of silver ore and a fresh, bloody scar on his face. No one ever mentioned a wife. It was as if Rebecca had been erased from the town's history. Ilara's fear grew, coiling in her gut. She started watching him, studying him when he wasn't looking. She noticed how his hands, scarred and calloused from work, could be surprisingly gentle when he was carving a piece of wood by the fire at night. He never spoke, but he would carve intricate animals, a bird, a wolf, a deer, and leave them on the mantelpiece. She saw the way his assistant Thomas scurried to do his bidding, his eyes wide with a fear that looked like more than just respect for a boss. She saw how the other men in town gave him a wide berth. They respected him, yes, but there was something else there, a deep, abiding fear. One evening, he was late coming home. A snowstorm had blown in, and by nightfall, it was a full-blown blizzard. Ilara found herself pacing, a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. She told herself it was just because her survival depended on him. But it was more than that. The thought of him out there in the storm. Just when she had given up hope, the door burst open, and he stumbled in, covered in snow, half frozen. He wasn't alone. He was supporting Thomas, who looked pale and was shivering violently. "Get the doctor," Sullivan rasped, helping the boy to the rocking chair by the fire. "Cave-in at the east tunnel. His leg is pinned." Ilara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the dead woman's coat and the lantern and plunged into the blizzard, following the guide rope to the doctor's house. The wind was a screaming monster, trying to rip the lantern from her hand, but she held on, her father's words echoing in her mind. Terrified, but moving forward anyway. When she returned with the doctor, Sullivan had cut away Thomas's pant leg. The injury was gruesome, a deep gash and a bone clearly broken. As the doctor worked, Ilara brought hot water and bandages. Sullivan stood back, his face grim, watching every move. She saw something in his eyes then. Not coldness, but a fierce, protective concern. After the doctor had set the leg and given Thomas a shot of laudanum for the pain, he turned to Sullivan. "He'll live, thanks to you. Another hour out there, and he would have frozen to death." Sullivan just nodded, his gaze fixed on the sleeping boy. The hero. That's what he was. He had saved the boy's life. But the town's fear, the whispers, the mystery of his first wife, it didn't add up. The next day, with Thomas resting in the spare room upstairs, the house was even quieter. Sullivan left for the mine, leaving Ilara to tend to the boy. Thomas was feverish and in pain, but when he was lucid, he was grateful. "He pulled me out himself," Thomas whispered, his eyes wide. "The timbers came down. I thought I was dead. He dug me out with his bare hands." "He's a brave man," Ilara said carefully. Thomas nodded, but then a shadow crossed his face. He's a good man, Miss Parker, but he has a darkness in him, from the accident. Lara's heart started pounding. The accident? With his wife, Rebecca. Thomas's eyes darted toward the door, as if Sullivan might hear. It happened up on the mountain, near the old claim. A storm, just like this one. They were both up there, but only he came back. He came back with a fortune in silver and a scar on his face. The pieces were slotting together, forming a picture that made Alara's blood run cold. That night, an idea took hold. A dangerous, reckless idea. Sullivan's room, the one downstairs he always kept locked. She had never been inside. He carried the key on a ring with his other keys. But what if there was another? Or what if, just once, he forgot to lock it? She had to know what was in that room. For a week she waited. She tended to Thomas, who was slowly recovering. She ran the household with an efficiency that surprised even herself. She and Sullivan fell into a routine, a silent dance around the house. They ate together, sat by the fire together, but they barely spoke a word. The silence was a living thing between them, filled with unspoken questions. Then one morning, her chance came. Sullivan was called away early, a problem at the smelter in the next town over. He would be gone all day. He saddled his horse in a hurry, shouting instructions to her from the yard. As she watched him ride away, she saw it, the ring of keys, sitting on the small table by the door. He had forgotten them. Her hands trembled as she picked them up. The cold metal felt heavy, dangerous. This was it. She could turn back, pretend she never saw them, and live with the fear and suspicion, or she could open that door and face whatever truth was hiding on the other side. She walked to the locked door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She found the right key, its iron teeth sliding into the lock. She turned it. The click was deafening in the silent house. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was not what she expected. It wasn't a monster's lair. It was a bedroom frozen in time. A thick layer of dust covered everything, but underneath it was a woman's room. A rocking chair with a half-finished piece of knitting still in the basket beside it. A dressing table with a silver-backed brush and a bottle of perfume. A large four-poster bed, neatly made. It was Rebecca's room. He had preserved it exactly as she had left it. Alara moved through the room like a ghost, touching nothing. It felt sacred, a tomb. Why would he keep it like this? Was it guilt or grief? Her eyes fell on a small, leather-bound book on the nightstand, a diary. Her breath caught. With trembling fingers, she picked it up and opened it to the last entry. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. October 14th, 1869. Jackson is obsessed. The new vein he found has consumed him. He talks of nothing else. He says it will make us rich, that we can finally leave this harsh place and go to San Francisco as we plan. But I see a madness in his eyes, a hunger. He wants to go up to the claim tomorrow, despite the warnings of an early blizzard. He frightens me. The way he looks at the mountain, it's like he loves it more than he loves me. He says we must go together to stake the claim properly. I have a terrible feeling about this. If I don't return, know that it was the mountain he chose. It was the silver. Ilara's blood ran cold. It was worse than she imagined. He had dragged his wife up a mountain into a blizzard, obsessed with silver, and she had never come back. She read the words again, her hands shaking so hard she could barely hold the book. She had to get out of this room, out of this house. She had to run. She turned, her eyes scanning the room for an escape, anything. And that's when she saw it. Tucked away under the bed, almost completely hidden, was a small wooden chest. Not dusty like the rest of the room. This had been accessed more recently. Forgetting her fear for a moment, driven by a desperate need to understand, she knelt and pulled it out. It wasn't locked. She lifted the lid. Inside was not what she expected. There were no hidden treasures, no sacks of silver. There were bundles of letters tied with ribbon, and underneath them, a man's journal. Jackson's. Her heart pounded. This was his side of the story. She opened it to the same date as Rebecca's last entry. His handwriting was rough, slanted, the words of a man who worked with his hands, not a pen. October 15th, 1869. Rebecca doesn't understand. This isn't about greed. It's about freedom. It's about getting her away from this place that is slowly killing her spirit. The doctor told me yesterday, her lungs, the cold and the altitude are too much. Another winter here, and she won't survive. This silver is our only chance to get her to a warm climate, to save her life. She thinks I'm mad, but I'm desperate. We go up the mountain at dawn. God help us. Alara stared at the page, her world tilting on its axis. Two diaries, two completely different stories. One of a woman who felt neglected, fearing her husband's greed. The other of a man terrified of losing his wife, willing to risk everything to save her. Which one was the truth? She frantically flipped to the next page in his journal. It was dated a week later. The handwriting was barely legible, spider-webbed across the page, stained with what looked like water or tears. October 22nd, 1869. She's gone. The storm. It came faster than I thought. An avalanche. A wall of white death. I had my arms around her, and then the world exploded. I woke up buried. It took me 2 days to dig myself out. My face on the rocks tore it open. My hands are frozen wreckage. I searched for her. For days. I called her name until my voice was gone. I found nothing. Just her locket, clutched in the snow. I found the vein, the silver that was supposed to save her. It's worthless now. Everything is worthless. I came down from the mountain a rich man, but I left my soul up there with her. Ilara let out a sob, her hand flying to her mouth. It wasn't murder. It wasn't greed. It was a tragedy, a story of desperate love and devastating loss. The scar on his face wasn't a mark of violence. It was a mark of grief. The town's fear wasn't of a killer, but of a man so broken, so haunted, that he was like a force of nature himself. He had locked up her room not to hide a crime, but to preserve a memory. He sat alone with his whiskey not in anger, but in mourning. The animals he carved. They were a silent tribute to a life that had been lost in the wilderness. She had been so wrong about everything. She carefully put the journals back, pushed the chest under the bed, and left the room, locking the door behind her. She placed the keys back on the table by the door, exactly where he had left them. When Jackson Sullivan returned that evening, tired and cold, he found the house was different. A fire blazed in the hearth. The table was set, and a rich, savory stew was simmering on the stove. Ilara didn't just serve him his meal. She sat down across from him. The silence was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer a silence of fear and suspicion. It was a silence of shared, unspoken understanding. He looked at her, his pale blue eyes searching her face. He must have known she'd been in the room. The keys, the subtle shift in the air. He waited for her to speak, to accuse him, to run. She met his gaze, her own eyes clear. "The stew is venison," she said softly. "I hope it's to your liking." A flicker of something crossed his face. Surprise, confusion. And then, for the first time since she had arrived, the harsh lines around his eyes softened, just for a moment. He picked up his spoon and nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't love, but it was a beginning, a truce. But they had no idea what was coming, because the secret of the mountain, the story of the avalanche, was more complicated than either of them knew. And a new threat was riding towards Silver Peak, a threat that knew exactly what had happened on that mountain, and planned to use it to burn Sullivan and the entire town to the ground. The fragile peace in the house on the edge of town lasted through the long, dark winter. Ilara and Jackson fell into a new rhythm. The silence between them remained, but it was now a comfortable one. She learned to read his moods by the set of his shoulders, by the way he held his hands. He in turn began to rely on the quiet order she brought to his life. He started leaving his carvings on her bedside table instead of the mantelpiece. A tiny, perfectly rendered fawn, a soaring eagle. They were his words, his way of speaking without speaking. Ilara, for her part, threw herself into her life in Silver Peak. Her work at the schoolhouse expanded. The miners, seeing that she was not just Sullivan's property, but a fixture in the community, began to approach her with their own problems. She helped them write letters home, calculate their earnings, and even mediate disputes. They started calling her Miss Ilara, a title of respect. She was building a life, a real one. She had a home, a purpose. She even had a friend in Mrs. Wilson who was overjoyed by the change in the Sullivan household. "It's like you've brought him back from the dead, dear," she said one afternoon over tea. But the ghost of Rebecca was always there. Alara knew the truth of the accident, but the town didn't. They still saw him as a haunted, dangerous man. The story of what happened on that mountain remained a dark secret. And secrets on the frontier have a way of getting out. Spring arrived with a sudden, violent thaw. The snow melted, the rivers swelled, and the mountain passes opened up again. And with the spring came trouble. It arrived in the form of a man in an expensive suit, riding a fine horse. He was followed by a team of surveyors. His name was Howard Green, and he was a representative of the Denver Consolidated Mining Company. He rode into town like he owned it, his eyes sweeping over everything with a cold, calculating gaze. He made no secret of his intentions. Denver Consolidated wanted to buy up all the claims in the valley, including the Silver Queen mine. Sullivan met with him at the assay office. Alara wasn't there, but Thomas later told her what happened. Green made an offer, a lowball offer that was more of an insult than a negotiation. Sullivan refused, politely but firmly. Green just smiled, a thin, unpleasant smile. "That's a mistake, Sullivan," he'd said. "You see, we don't just buy mines, we buy towns. We're going to build our own settlement just south of here, with a direct rail line. In a year, Silver Peak will be a ghost town. We're calling our town New Prosperity." It was a declaration of war. The news sent a shockwave through Silver Peak. A rival town with a railroad? It would be the end of them. All their ore, all their business would be siphoned away. That night, the house was tense again. Sullivan paced in front of the fire, his fists clenched. "He's trying to starve us out," he growled. "Bleed us dry until we have no choice but to sell for pennies on the dollar." Alara watched him. She had seen him grieve. She had seen him work, but she had never seen him this angry. "What if we fight back?" and she said quietly. He stopped pacing and looked at her. "How? They have money. They have political connections. We're just a mining camp." "We're more than that," she insisted. "We're a community. And you're not thinking like a businessman, you're thinking like a miner. They want to compete? Then let's compete. Silver Peak is on the main route to 3 other camps. If we had a proper hotel, an expanded store, we could become the supply hub for the entire region. If we had our own smelter, we wouldn't have to ship our ore to them for processing." He stared at her, his pale eyes wide with surprise. She was laying out a business plan, a strategy for survival. She wasn't just a housekeeper. She was a partner. "It would take capital," he said, the anger in his voice replaced by a grudging respect. "More than I have." "Then we find partners," she said, her mind racing. "Frank Murphy at the saloon wants to expand. Mr. Mason at the store has been talking about it for years. The miners themselves. What if they had a stake in the town's success? It was a radical idea, a cooperative, a town that owned itself." The next day, Sullivan called a town meeting. He stood before the assembled miners and merchants, and to everyone's surprise, he asked Alara to stand with him. He laid out the threat from Denver Consolidated. Then he laid out her plan. You could feel the shift in the room. The fear and despair were replaced by a spark of defiance. Alara's ideas made sense. They were a long shot, but they were a shot. It was a chance to fight for their homes, not just sell them. The battle for Silver Peak had begun, but Howard Green had an ace up his sleeve, a dark, ugly secret he had been waiting to play. A few weeks later, as construction on the new hotel began, Green rode back into town. He didn't go to the assay office. He came directly to the house. Alara was in the garden she had started behind the house, her hands in the dirt, when he approached. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said. At least that's what she thought he said. He had called her Miss Parker. "It's Mrs. Sullivan now," she said, her voice cold. He smiled that snake's smile again. "Is it? I wonder for how long. I knew your husband, you know. Years ago, before he was the king of Silver Peak, before the accident." Alara felt a chill go through her. "A terrible tragedy," Green continued, his eyes glinting with malice. "His poor wife, Rebecca, so young, so beautiful, a real Boston lady. Funny thing about that avalanche, though, the timing of it. Just as Sullivan finds the richest silver vein in the territory, and just as Rebecca was preparing to leave him, Elara's heart stopped. That's a lie. Is it? Green said smoothly. I have letters. Letters from Rebecca to her sister, describing his rages, his obsession, describing how she was afraid for her life, how she was planning to take her share of their money and go back east. Letters that would be very interesting to a territorial judge. Letters that paint a picture not of a tragic accident, but of a very convenient murder. He let the word hang in the air. Murder. Sell us the mine, Sullivan, Green said, his voice dropping to a whisper, or these letters become public. Your husband won't just lose his mine. He'll hang. The threat was clear. He wasn't just trying to bankrupt them. He was trying to destroy Jackson's life, to put a rope around his neck. Elara stood there, her hands still covered in dirt, the world spinning around her. She had seen the diaries. She knew the truth. But Green had letters. A different story. A story that could kill the man she was just beginning to, what? Respect? Understand? Care for? Green saw the fear in her eyes and mistook it for surrender. You're a smart woman, Miss Parker. Convince him. It's the only way. He turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the garden with the terrible choice. That night, she told Jackson everything. She watched his face as she spoke, saw the color drain from it, saw the old grief and a new fury battle in his eyes. The letters, he said, his voice hoarse. Rebecca was unhappy. She missed Boston. She wrote to her sister often, but she would never, I would never. I know, Elara said, and she was surprised by the certainty in her own voice. I know you wouldn't. Green was my partner once, Sullivan confessed, staring into the fire. Before Rebecca, we staked a claim together. He cheated me, tried to steal the whole thing. I ran him out of camp. He's hated me ever since. He must have gotten his hands on those letters from Rebecca's sister after she died. So it was revenge, a cold, calculated revenge, years in the making. What do we do? Elara asked. Jackson looked at her, and in his eyes she saw utter defeat. He has me. If those letters get out, no one will believe my story. A grieving husband doesn't come down from a mountain with his pockets full of silver. They'll see what they've always suspected, that I'm a killer. But Elara Parker was not the same woman who had stepped off that stagecoach months ago. She was not a victim. She was a survivor, and she was not going to let this snake, Howard Green, destroy the life she had just started to build. No, she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. They won't, because we are going to tell them the truth first. She walked to his locked room, the one he hadn't opened since that first day. Give me the key, she said. It wasn't a request. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and handed it to her. She unlocked the door to Rebecca's room, then she turned to him. We are going to open this room. We are going to pack away her things, and you are going to tell the story of what happened, not to a judge, to the town, to our friends. She was asking him to reopen the deepest wound of his life, to expose his grief and his pain to the world. It was a terrifying gamble. They could be run out of town, or worse, but it was the only move they had left. The next day, the door to Rebecca's room stood open. Elara and Mrs. Wilson carefully, respectfully packed away Rebecca's belongings into wooden trunks. News of what they were doing spread through town like wildfire. That evening, Sullivan called another town meeting. The church was packed. Every single person in Silver Peak was there. Howard Green stood at the back, a smug look on his face, ready to watch Sullivan's downfall. Jackson Sullivan stood before them, Elara at his side. He was not the confident mine owner they were used to. He was a man stripped bare, his voice raw with a pain he had held inside for years. He told them everything, about his love for Rebecca, about her illness, about his desperate plan to save her. He told them about the avalanche, about digging himself out, about searching for her until his hands were bloody stumps. He didn't make excuses. He didn't hide his grief. He simply told the truth. When he was finished, a heavy silence fell over the church. No one moved. No one spoke. Howard Green chose that moment to step forward, a packet of letters in his hand. A very touching story, he said. his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I have here a different version of events. Letters from the deceased herself, describing a woman living in fear of her greedy, violent husband." He began to read from one of the letters, but as his voice echoed in the silent church, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Wilson stood up. "I remember Rebecca," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I remember her being sad. She missed her home, but I never once saw her afraid of her husband. I saw a man who doted on her." Then Mr. Mason stood up. "I saw Jackson Sullivan carry a 50-pound sack of flour all the way to his house through a snowstorm because his wife had a craving for a certain kind of cake. That is not the act of a monster." Then another miner stood, and another, each with a small story, a memory of Jackson's kindness to his wife, of his quiet devotion. They were building a wall of truth around him, brick by brick. The people of Silver Peak had seen the truth all along. They weren't afraid of him because they thought he was a killer. They were afraid for him. They had respected his privacy, his silent grief. They had protected him. Howard Green stood there, the letters in his hand suddenly worthless. He had misjudged the town. He had misjudged the bonds of community that had been forged in that harsh, unforgiving place. He had misjudged Elara. He turned and stormed out of the church, his face a mask of fury. The battle wasn't over. He had lost this fight, but the war for Silver Peak's survival had just escalated. Green was no longer just a corporate rival. He was a man bent on personal destruction, and he would use any means necessary. As the townspeople gathered around Jackson, offering their support, their condolences, Elara stood by his side, her hand resting on his arm. He looked at her, his pale blue eyes filled with a gratitude that went deeper than words. In that moment, they were no longer just a man and his mail-order bride. They were partners, a team, the king and queen of a small, rugged kingdom, preparing to defend it against a siege. And the first battle of that siege was coming with the winter snow. A battle that would test them all and earn Elara her name in the history books forever. Howard Green, humiliated and furious, did not retreat to Denver. He doubled down. He set up his camp for the new town of New Prosperity and began an aggressive campaign to choke the life out of Silver Peak. He poached workers with promises of higher wages. He undercut prices on supplies, even taking a loss, to try and bankrupt Mason's store. He used his company's influence to delay and dispute Silver Peak's supply shipments. It was a slow, grinding war of attrition. Every day brought a new challenge. Elara became the town's de facto general, Sullivan her field commander. She managed the finances, stretching every dollar. She organized a town-wide cooperative, pooling resources so that no single family would go under. Sullivan worked with the miners, inspiring a fierce loyalty that money couldn't buy. They were holding on, but just barely. Then winter came. It arrived early and with a biblical fury. The first storm in mid-November dropped 4 feet of snow overnight, and it just kept coming. The mountain passes were sealed. The half-finished railway line to New Prosperity was buried. The world shrank to the snow-choked valley of Silver Peak. Green had to halt his construction. His crews huddled in their flimsy, unfinished buildings. But he saw the blizzard not as a setback, but as an opportunity, a final, brutal weapon. He knew Silver Peak had a weakness. A small, high-altitude mining camp called Eagle Peak, home to 30 men and their families, was now completely cut off. Their winter supplies were delivered by a train of mules, a journey that was now impossible. They had maybe 2 weeks of food and fuel. Green did nothing. He had supplies. He had men who could possibly get through on snowshoes. But he sat in his warm office and waited. He knew that when word of Eagle Peak's plight reached Silver Peak, they would have to act. They would have to mount a rescue that would drain their own precious, limited resources and likely cost lives. It was a perfect, cruel trap. Word came, just as Green knew it would, from a lone prospector who had barely made it down before the worst of the storm hit. The news was grim. Eagle Peak was isolated and running out of everything. An emergency meeting was held in the saloon. The mood was bleak. "It's a suicide mission," Frank Murphy, the saloon owner, said flatly. "The pass is under 20 feet of snow. The avalanche risk is off the charts." Men nodded in agreement. They were brave, but they weren't foolish. Then Alara spoke. Her voice cut through the despair. So we do nothing? We let 30 people, including women and children, freeze to death on that mountain because it's difficult? The men fell silent, shamed by her words. There has to be a way, she insisted. It was Sullivan who provided it. The Norwegians, he said, the crew working the north face. They built sleds, snow sleds with wide runners, pulled by dogs. They said they could travel over any depth of snow. A spark of hope ignited in the room. The Norwegians had evacuated to Silver Peak just before the storm hit. They were in this room, right now. A tall, blond miner named Lars Eriksson stood up. The sleds can make it, he said, his accent thick. But the danger, the mountain in a storm like this, she is a hungry beast. We'll pay you, Sullivan said. Lars shook his head. This is not for pay. He looked at Alara, then at the faces of his fellow miners. We are all in this together. We will go. A cheer went up. Volunteers were clamoring to join. They had a plan. They had hope. But as Alara organized the supplies, food, blankets, medicine, a terrible realization dawned on her. Their own supplies were critically low. The rescue mission would take almost everything they had left. If the blizzard didn't break soon, she might be saving the people of Eagle Peak only to watch the people of Silver Peak starve. It was a gamble for the town's very soul. She packed the sleds, her face a mask of calm resolve, but inside her heart was a cold knot of fear. Sullivan came to her as the rescue party prepared to leave before dawn. I'm going with them, he said. It wasn't a question. No, Ilara said, the word escaping her lips before she could stop it. Jackson, you can't. The town needs you here. I know the terrain better than anyone, he said, his voice gentle but firm. And I will not ask men to take a risk I am unwilling to take myself. He placed his scarred hands on her shoulders. You are the one this town needs, Alara. You are its heart and its mind. Keep them safe until we get back. He was right, and she knew it. Fear for him warred with the immense weight of the responsibility he had just placed on her. She took off a small silver locket she always wore, a gift from her mother. Take this, she whispered, for luck. Bring it back to me. He closed his hand around it. I will. She stood in the swirling snow and watched them leave, a small train of men and dogs disappearing into a world of white. Then she turned back to the town, her people, and she prepared them for a siege. She implemented rationing immediately. Every lump of coal, every scrap of food was accounted for. She organized work crews to keep roofs from collapsing under the weight of the snow and to dig tunnels between the buildings. She turned the schoolhouse into an infirmary and the saloon's main room into a community hall where everyone gathered for warmth and shared meals. She was everywhere at once, her calm strength a force against the fear and the cold. The town, seeing her tireless resolve, responded in kind. They worked together, they shared, they endured. They became one large, stubborn family determined to survive. Days turned into a week, then two. The blizzard never stopped. Food supplies dwindled. The cold was relentless. People were getting sick. The doctor was running out of medicine. Doubt began to creep in. Had the rescue party made it? Were they even still alive? Alara refused to let despair take hold. She read to the children in the evenings. She organized singing. She kept hope alive with her own sheer force of will. Meanwhile, in his camp, Howard Green watched and waited. His scouts reported on Silver Peak's dwindling supplies. They told him about the rescue mission that had not returned. He smiled. The mountain and the winter were doing his work for him. Soon they would be broken. He would ride in and buy the entire town for the price of a few wagon loads of food. But he had underestimated them. He had underestimated the bonds of their community. And most of all, he had underestimated Alara. One morning, just as the last of the flour was being used to bake a thin, watery bread, a lookout stationed in the church bell tower let out a cry. Sleds! They're coming down from the pass! The town erupted. People poured out of the buildings, shouting and crying. Alara ran with them, her heart pounding, scanning the small figures emerging from the snow. It was them. They were back. The sleds were laden with people, the survivors from Eagle Peak, frost-bitten and starving, but alive. Sullivan was at the rear, half carrying an exhausted Lars Eriksson. His face was gaunt, his beard caked with ice, but he was alive. And when his eyes found hers across the cheering crowd, he smiled. He had come back. He had brought the locket back. The joy was short-lived. They had saved 27 people, but the cost was immense. The rescuers were exhausted, some with severe frostbite. The town's food supply was now almost completely gone. They had won the battle, but they were about to lose the war. They had maybe 3 days of food left. That night, as the storm raged on, Alara sat at her desk, staring at the town's ledger. The numbers told a grim story. They were at the end of their rope. And then she heard a knock at the door. It was Thomas, his face pale. "Miss Alara," he stammered. "It's Howard Green. He's here. He wants to see you and Mr. Sullivan." Green walked into their house like a conquering hero. He didn't even bother to take off his snow-covered coat. "I hear you've had some success," he said, his voice smug, "and some difficulties. It seems you're in a bit of a bind. No food, no medicine. Another week of this storm, and you'll start bearing your own." Sullivan took a step forward, his fist clenched, but Alara put a hand on his arm. "What do you want, Green?" she asked, her voice steady. "The same thing I've always wanted," he said. "The Silver Queen mine. The town. All of it. Sign it over to me, and a train of supply wagons will be here by morning. I'll be the hero, the savior of Silver Peak. Refuse, and I'll let the winter finish the job." It was the ultimate checkmate. He had them. They could save themselves, but only by surrendering everything they had fought for. Sullivan looked at Alara, his face a mask of agony. He was ready to refuse, to die on his feet rather than live on his knees. But Alara looked past Green, her eyes focused on something else. She looked at the snow piling up against the window. She looked at the howling wind, and she smiled. A small, strange, confident smile. "No," she said. Green laughed. "Brave words, Mrs. Sullivan, but bravery won't fill your children's bellies." "It's not bravery, Mr. Green," she said, her voice soft, almost conversational. "It's mathematics. You see, you've made a critical error in your calculations. You think this blizzard is your weapon, but you're wrong." She walked to the window. "This storm has buried your railway. It has trapped your men in their camp with their own limited supplies. You think you have us in a cage, but the truth is, we're all in the same cage, and your cage is smaller than ours." Then she delivered the final blow. "One of the miners we rescued from Eagle Peak was their telegraph operator," she said. "Before he left, he sent one last message, not to us, to the territorial capital in Helena. He told them about the blizzard, he told them about Eagle Peak being cut off, and he told them that Denver Consolidated, the only other party in the valley with the resources to help, had refused to offer aid." The smug look on Green's face vanished, replaced by dawning horror. "When this storm breaks, Mr. Green," Alara continued, her voice like ice, "the first people to get through won't be your supply wagons, it will be the territorial marshals, and they'll have a warrant for your arrest. Negligent homicide, at least 30 counts of it. You didn't just trap us, you trapped yourself." Green stood there speechless, his face as white as the snow outside. He had been so focused on his revenge, so sure of his victory, that he had never seen the trap she had laid for him. He had come to watch them die, but he had just walked into his own execution. The Queen of the Frontier had made her final move. Howard Green stumbled out of the house and into the storm, a broken man. He knew she was right. His ambition and hatred had blinded him, and he had overplayed his hand spectacularly. His war was over. 2 days later, the blizzard broke. The sun came out, weak at first, then brilliant, reflecting off a world remade in white and crystal. And just as Alara had predicted, the first sign of the outside world was a party of men on snowshoes, led by a grim-faced territorial marshal. They didn't stop in Silver Peak. They went directly to the camp of New Prosperity and arrested Howard Green. The supply wagons that followed were not Green's. They were sent by the territory, a relief effort for the entire valley. Silver Peak, because of its organization and Alara's careful rationing, had fared better than Green's own camp. They had not just survived, they had prevailed. The story of the great blizzard of '78 and of the small town that rescued its neighbors while fending off a corporate predator became a legend on the frontier. Newspapers in Denver and even Chicago wrote about it. They wrote about the heroic miners in their Norwegian sleds. They wrote about the grizzled, scarred mine owner who led them. But most of all, they wrote about his wife, the quiet, educated woman from Boston who had become the town's heart, mind, and unbreakable will. One journalist, trying to capture the essence of her leadership, gave her a nickname. He called her the Queen of the Frontier. The name stuck. In the years that followed, Silver Peak didn't just recover, it thrived. With Denver consolidated out of the picture, Ilara's vision for a cooperative, diversified community became a reality. The smelter was built. The hotel was finished. The railroad, when it was finally dug out, built its spur to Silver Peak, not to the ghost town of New Prosperity. Ilara and Jackson's partnership, forged in crisis, deepened into a quiet, powerful love. The house on the edge of town filled with the sound of children's laughter. First a boy, William, then a girl, Rebecca, named for the woman whose memory they had finally laid to rest. Ilara never ruled from a throne. Her throne was the kitchen table where she drew up plans for the town's first hospital. It was the schoolhouse where she taught a new generation of children not just to read, but to think. It was the front porch where anyone in town, from a miner's widow to the bank president, could come for advice. She never wore a crown. But when she walked down the main street of the town she had saved, the people of Silver Peak, the miners, the merchants, the mothers, the children, looked at her with a respect and affection that no monarch could ever command. She had arrived with nothing but a small bag and a desperate hope. She had faced down a monster only to find a broken man. She had stared into the heart of a blizzard and refused to blink. She had taken a dying mining camp and transformed it into a beacon of hope on the American frontier. The mail-order bride from Boston had found her kingdom, not in the silver buried in the mountain, but in the fierce, resilient hearts of the people who called it home. And 20 years later, when a young, frightened woman would step off a stagecoach, clutching a single bag and facing an uncertain future, she wouldn't be met by suspicious stares in a cold, grim town. She would be met by a community built to welcome her, with systems in place to help her. And she would be greeted by a woman with kind, intelligent eyes and silver streaks in her auburn hair. A woman who would look at her and see a reflection of her own journey. "Welcome to Silver Peak," the woman would say, her voice warm and steady. "My name is Ilara Sullivan. We've been expecting you." It was a legacy more valuable than silver, more enduring than stone. An empire built not of power, but of purpose. This story took a long time to put together, so if you enjoyed it, it would mean the world to us if you'd hit that subscribe button. We have so many more stories like this to share, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Thank you for joining us in Silver Peak. We'll see you in the next one.